My first piece of advice for preparing for the sight reading portion of the audition might seem a little obvious. Sight read something every day. Most of you wouldn't dream of going into an audition without having learned your scales or thoroughly practiced your etudes. But it can be easy to say to yourself, well, I've prepared for what I can prepare for, without realizing that the sight reading portion of the audition will also benefit from regular and diligent preparation. This begins by simply resolving to sight read something every day. Make yourself go through the processes that I will discuss in this video, so that you will begin to instinctively approach new pieces of music in this way. When you get to the audition, you will find that these habits will enable you to approach the sight reading more calmly, more melodically, more methodically, and more accurately. And practice sight reading a variety of music of different difficulty levels. While those with more audition experience might be able to develop a very broad idea of what the sight reading etudes will be like in the audition, nobody can anticipate with certainty what the demands will be with regard to key signature, meter, rhythm, tempo, range. There are many variables creating very many possibilities. What this means for your preparation is that you need to find materials for sight reading practice that account for as many of these variables as possible. You don't want to turn that piece of paper over and find yourself sight reading a certain key, meter, tempo, or other musical element for the first time. A related suggestion is to find sight reading music of various difficulty levels. Learning to sight read very simple music perfectly can help you to develop confidence in yourself and in the process, while attempting to read very difficult music will increase your reading ability and ensure that the actual sight reading in the audition will seem easy by comparison. Third, master scale and arpeggio patterns and apply them. Scale patterns are not just exercises that we work on to play for auditions or pass-offs. In reality, they are, along with arpeggio patterns, the building blocks of much musical material that you will encounter. The more fully you master these patterns, the better able you will be to recognize them when they occur in music. You will then be able to execute these patterns by thinking of the notes in groups rather than one at a time, thus simplifying the thought process and improving technique. Of course, not all music follows these patterns all the time, and sight reading examples in particular often introduce unexpected intervals. Still, in all tonal music, you will have many instances where series of notes follow a known pattern of some kind. The more of these you can instantly recognize and execute in groups, the easier time you will have. Now, I want to shift now for a bit from practice strategies to how to approach sight reading while in the room. As with basically everything else in preparing for and executing a successful audition, effective sight reading demands a deliberate and methodical approach. When you are instructed to turn over the paper with your sight reading materials, begin by looking at the key signature, time signature, and tempo. Too often, students will immediately launch into looking through or fingering through the music without first looking at this vital information. Sadly, they sometimes don't realize the error until they make an obvious key signature mistake when playing, play with an obviously inappropriate tempo, or have counting problems because they didn't think about the metric feel before beginning to play. Taking the first few seconds to note these important items before proceeding to look through the sight reading piece as a whole is vitally important. Now, after you are clear on key, meter, and tempo, don't just start reading through from left to right. Scan through briefly to see if there's anything especially difficult in the exercise, something that stands out as being particularly challenging compared to the rest of it. This could be an unusual rhythm, one or more accidentals, a large leap or descent in pitch, or maybe something otherwise simple enough that happens to be one of your personal weak spots. Whatever it is, take time to work through these hard spots. And then after that, you can use whatever time remains to try and work through the entire exercise. This way, you are much more likely to have adequate time to address those especially difficult spots. And in the end, this is much more important even than having time to look through the whole thing. Sixth, go a little slower than you might think. I've already mentioned that the tempo should be one of the first things you note when examining the sight reading piece. And then take whatever you think that tempo is, whatever you think that marking means, and slow it down a little. Practically everyone gets a little nervous, a little anxious, or at least a little excited in an audition situation. Your pulse gets a little faster, your breathing shallower, and the tendency is to go faster than you think you're going. Now, this can cause problems in all parts of the audition, but is particularly problematic when sight reading. So look at the tempo, figure out how fast you think it should be, and then go a little slower. Chances are where you end up will be closer to the correct tempo, and you will almost certainly be more successful at the sight reading. In fact, this slow it down a little advice can apply really to all parts of the audition. Now, maintain good rhythm and time. For whatever reason, most students seem to place a higher priority on playing correct pitches than correct rhythms. While we of course want you to play the right notes, what students sometimes fail to realize is that when the rhythm is not at least somewhat there, the piece quickly becomes unrecognizable. The reverse of this is not always true. Try playing just the rhythm to a simple song like Mary Had a Little Lamb to some friends or family members. Just the rhythms on a single pitch or even tapped on a desk or a table. Chances are they'll still be able to identify the song. But if you were to take the same song and play the melody with incorrect and unusual rhythms, most people have a harder time identifying that tune. I had a professor in graduate school who told us that the wrong pitch in the right place is half right, but the right pitch in the wrong place is completely wrong. That's counterintuitive at first, I guess, but it makes sense. If you get the rhythm right but miss pitches, you're still making sounds where sounds ought to happen. But if you get pitches right and miss the rhythms, you're making sounds where sounds ought not to happen, and it sounds all wrong. Now, I'm not saying that you should ignore pitch, of course, but I am saying that maybe you should place a little higher priority on right rhythms. You'll very likely find that playing with good rhythm and time also has a way of improving pitch accuracy, and your score will almost certainly improve. Now, speaking of pitch, be aggressive, especially with large intervals. Brass players have a particular challenge that is not shared by our woodwind and percussion colleagues, and that it is possible to play all of the fingerings or slide positions correctly and yet miss every pitch. The vibration is created by the lips buzzing, rather than by a part of the instrument, and we must correctly hear the pitches internally in order to execute them effectively. One unhappy effect of performance anxiety when sight reading is the tendency to compress large intervals. Students that can read well when a piece moves by step will suddenly begin missing notes if there is a leap or descent in pitch of more than a fifth or so. Being too reticent to step out on large intervals, students will compress those intervals and play on the wrong partial with unhappy results. When reading, go ahead and find the first note before beginning so that you're sure to start on the right pitch, and then proceed with confidence, even pretend confidence if necessary, hearing the intervals internally to the best of your ability and really going after the notes, especially when there is a large interval. Ninth, observe dynamic articulation and style markings. While playing the correct notes and rhythms should rightly be prioritized in sight reading, those that earn the highest scores will go beyond this. Most sight reading exercises in all state auditions have a fair number of dynamic articulation and other stylistic markings. These are part of the music too, and will be observed by those who receive the highest scores. Now, I'll conclude this video by suggesting some materials that can help you with your sight reading preparation. Given the importance of rhythm and the difficulties many students experience in this area, let me suggest some books for working on rhythm. You may find some of these in a band room somewhere, or maybe your band director has a copy or can help you locate one. Others you may need to purchase for yourself. The first of these is Exercises for Ensemble Drill by Raymond Fussell. This has a few rhythm pages with 150 or so rhythm patterns. And if you familiarize yourself with these, you'll find that you have an easier time with some of the more difficult sight reading passages. A more comprehensive book on this subject is Rhythmic Training by Robert Sterer. This is a whole book just dedicated to teaching you to work with difficult rhythms and meters. Some materials more oriented toward full band practice include 40 Rhythmical Studies and 101 Rhythmic Rest Patterns, both by Grover C. Yaus. These are kind of older books, but a lot of bands will have them just in the library, or maybe they've used them for full band rhythm practice in your program. These can be very helpful to helping you to develop a better rhythmic sense. Moving to materials for sight reading practice generally, one of these is a little series called All State Sight Reading, published by a company called Music Services Unlimited over in Georgia. This is a set of short exercises, maybe a little bit shorter actually than the typical Lions Band sight reading. But they have a variety of difficulty levels, meters, key signatures, pretty well everything that you'll need to practice. And if you start reading through these exercises, you'll find yourself gradually getting pretty well prepared for lots of different kinds of sight reading. A considerably harder book in this vein is Develop Sight Reading by Gaston Dufresne. This is the book that my teacher used with me and my friends when we were studying and preparing for Lions Band auditions back in the day. And it's really hard. Some of the exercises in the back I still find to be very difficult and challenging. There are editions for both treble and bass clef, and the bass clef edition includes quite a bit of tenor clef, which, well, I guess can be a little off-putting if you don't read tenor clef, but honestly the exercises are weird enough that they still work. You could just pretend it's all in bass clef and go ahead. Again, these are very, very challenging, definitely overtraining compared to what you'll ever encounter at the Lions Band audition. But I'll tell you, when I was using this book to prepare for Lions Band, I never thought that the actual sight reading at Lions Band was very hard. So if you can even kind of read super difficult exercises like these, you're going to find that the actual audition music is not very hard for you. And next, as you might imagine, there is now an app for this. There's probably more than one, but the one that I'm most familiar with is called Sight Reading Factory. This service does require a subscription fee, but many band programs subscribe to it already, so you may be able to get access to it through your school. You can configure this app to automatically generate sight reading exercises of literally any difficulty level, controlling all sorts of variables like key signatures, meters, tempos, rhythms, etc. You could generate an endless amount of sight reading material to practice through that app, so it is an outstanding tool for that purpose. But you don't have to have a particular method book or app devoted to sight reading. Literally any piece of music can be fit material for sight reading practice. Look through old music that you might have or a family member might have, or even things you find in the band room somewhere lying around. It doesn't even have to be for your instrument. Just find some music, pretend it's in the right clef for you if necessary, and follow the steps outlined here to try to read through it. If you need help finding something to read, I'm sure your band director has access to ample material and will be happy to help.